Welcome to Cafe Stories. I hope you're doing well wherever you're watching from today. Before we begin, you may notice we've introduced a new visual style and a more cinematic presentation in our episodes. We've been putting a lot of care into improving the experience. But your opinion matters most. Do you like this new direction? Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're tuning in from. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin.
In Bloomsbury, truth is never harmless. A philosopher invites 6 strangers to dinner. A publisher drowning in debt. A novelist on the edge. A disgraced doctor. And a woman with a past. They called her the Black Swan. But before midnight, one man would be murdered. A glass of port. A missing manuscript, a single feather caught in the door, and silence, so loud it could scream. Because everyone inside that house had something to hide. The evidence will point exactly where it is meant to, but the truth is far more sinister. So tell me, when a man promises to expose everyone in the room, who survives the evening? Who killed Professor Montague?
The Black Swan of Bloomsbury. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Bloomsbury. The invitation lay upon Poirot's mantelpiece like a small white challenge. I noticed it the moment I entered his sitting room that October afternoon, though my friend made no immediate reference to it. "You have the look of a man, Hastings, who has been contemplating the countryside with insufficient appreciation," Poirot observed. He adjusted a cushion with the precision of a man correcting the universe. "The complexion, it is too pale. The eye, it lacks sparkle." "I've been in Sussex for a fortnight," I replied, dropping into my usual chair. "Visiting my sister, perfectly restful actually." "Ah, but rest without purpose, it is the slow death of the mind, is it not?" He moved to his desk where several letters awaited his attention. "Fortunately, I have the remedy. We dine tonight in Bloomsbury." I glanced at the invitation card. The script was elegant, formal. "Professor Alistair Montague requests the pleasure of your company at a literary supper," I read aloud. "Russell Square, 8 o'clock. Good Lord, Poirot, philosophy and port wine, that's rather outside your usual sphere." "On the contrary, mon ami, the criminal mind and the philosophical mind, they are not so different. Both ask questions, both seek patterns." He paused, examining his reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. A minute adjustment to his tie followed. "Besides, I rendered the professor a small service some years ago, a matter of a stolen manuscript he has not forgotten." "And the occasion tonight?" "The professor entertains, I understand, a most distinguished guest, a Parisian dancer known as the Black Swan." Poirot's tone held a note of interest. "Miss Odette Lenoir. You have heard of her, perhaps?" I confessed I had not. "Then you shall have the pleasure of discovery." He consulted his watch. "We must leave within the hour. Bloomsbury expects punctuality, even from Belgians." The taxi deposited us before a handsome Georgian townhouse, just as the church clock struck 8. Russell Square stretched away into the evening shadows, its garden railings black against the fading light. Light spilled from the first-floor windows of Professor Montague's residence, and voices drifted down to the street. A maid admitted us. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax and old books, that particular scent of academic prosperity. Our coats were taken, and we were shown upstairs to a drawing-room where 5 people stood in attitudes of polite conversation. Professor Alistair Montague came forward at once. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with iron-grey hair swept back from a high forehead and the sort of face that suggested both intellect and obstinacy in equal measure. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, how good of you to come." His handshake was firm. "You know my wife, I think?" Mrs. Helena Montague was perhaps 30, dark-haired and composed. She wore a gown of deep green that set off her pale skin. Her greeting was gracious, but her eyes held a certain watchfulness. "And may I present the other guests?" the professor continued. "Dr. Julian Markham, formerly of King's College." Markham was a lean man of about 40 with restless hands and the bearing of someone accustomed to lecture halls. He acknowledged us with a brief nod. Miss Beatrice Howell, the novelist. Miss Howell was perhaps 50, grey-haired, with shrewd eyes behind spectacles. She smiled, but said nothing. Mr. Cedric Vale, my publisher. Vale was younger than I expected, not yet 40, with thinning fair hair and the nervous energy of a man with too many worries. "And our guest of honour," Professor Montague concluded, turning towards the window where a woman stood silhouetted against the lamplight. "Miss Odette Lenoir." She moved forward, and I understood at once why they called her the Black Swan. Everything about her suggested controlled grace. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her frame too angular. But there was something compelling in the way she carried herself. She wore black naturally, and a single white feather adorned her dark hair. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her accent musical, "the professor speaks of you with great admiration." "You are too kind, mademoiselle." Poirot bowed. "And you grace London with your art, I understand." "For a brief season only. Then I return to Paris." Her smile was enigmatic. One cannot stay away from home indefinitely. Sherry was poured. Conversation resumed. I found myself beside Dr. Markham, who seemed disinclined to small talk. "You're a friend of Montague's?" I ventured. "I was his student once." Markham's tone was careful. "Many years ago now." "And you remained in London?" "Professional reasons." He sipped his sherry. "Academic life has its complications." Before I could pursue this cryptic remark, the maid announced dinner. We filed into the dining-room, where candles gleamed upon silver, and the table was laid with academic precision. I found myself seated between Miss Howell and Mrs. Montague, with Poirot opposite beside Miss Lenoir. The meal began with oysters. Professor Montague held court from the head of the table, his voice carrying effortlessly. "I've asked you all here tonight for a particular reason," he announced. "Beyond the pleasure of company, that is. I'm completing my final work, a philosophical treatise on truth and hypocrisy. It will be published in the spring." Mr. Vale shifted in his seat. "As we discussed, Professor, the manuscript requires nothing but honesty." Montague's interruption was smooth, "which is precisely what it delivers, an examination of how we deceive ourselves and others, how we construct elegant lies and call them society." An awkward silence followed. Miss Howell set down her fork with deliberate care. "Rather a broad subject," Dr. Markham observed. "On the contrary, I deal in specifics, names, instances, actual cases of intellectual fraud and moral cowardice." The professor smiled. "The final chapter, in particular, will prove illuminating." I glanced at Poirot. His green eyes were thoughtful, moving from face to face around the table. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The evening, which had begun with such civility, now carried an undercurrent I could not quite identify. Mrs. Montague rose. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion over coffee in the drawing-room," As we left the dining room, I caught sight of Miss Lenoir's face in the candlelight. The black swan was no longer smiling. The drawing-room awaited us, warm and bright, innocent of the shadows gathering beyond its walls. Chapter 2. The Supper and the Study. Coffee arrived in delicate china cups. The drawing-room settled into that particular rhythm of after-dinner conversation, voices rising and falling, laughter measured, tensions carefully masked. Professor Montague stood by the fireplace, brandy in hand. He appeared to relish the discomfort his earlier remarks had caused. "You disapprove of my approach, Markham?" The professor directed his question across the room. "You think philosophy should remain abstract, divorced from actual human behavior?" Dr. Markham set down his cup with precision. "I think there's a difference between philosophical inquiry and public accusation." "Is there?" "How convenient for those with secrets to protect." The words hung in the air. Mrs. Montague moved between them with the ease of long practice. "More coffee, Dr. Markham. Miss Lenoir, you must tell us about Paris. The theatre season this year, is it as brilliant as they say?" Miss Lenoir accepted the diversion gracefully. "The opera has mounted a new production of Giselle. Quite traditional, but the audiences seem to appreciate tradition." She paused, her dark eyes meeting the professor's. "Though I confess I prefer work that challenges rather than comforts." "Spoken like a true artist," Montague replied. "We must challenge, mustn't we? Strip away pretense, reveal what lies beneath. In art, perhaps." Miss Lenoir's smile was cool. "In life, such revelations can be cruel." "Truth is never cruel, only necessary." Miss Howell spoke for the first time since dinner. Her voice was quiet, measured. "I wonder if you'd say that, Professor, if the truth being revealed were your own?" Montague laughed. "But my dear Miss Howell, I have no secrets. My life is an open book, unlike your novels, which I understand draw rather heavily on real incidents poorly disguised." The novelist's face flushed. "Fiction requires inspiration. And discretion, one would hope." He turned to Poirot, who had been observing from a chair near the window. "What do you think, Monsieur Poirot? You deal in truths daily. Should they be exposed regardless of consequence?" Poirot's fingers formed a steeple. "The truth, Professor, is like a diamond. It has many facets. The angle from which one views it changes everything." "How delightfully evasive." "How delightfully Belgian," Poirot corrected, his tone mild. Mr. Vale cleared his throat. "About the manuscript, Professor, the legal readers have raised some concerns, libel laws being what they are." "My lawyers assure me we're on solid ground." Montague refilled his brandy glass. "The final chapter names no one who cannot be proven guilty of precisely what I accuse them of. Documentation exists, evidence, witnesses." "Then perhaps," Mrs. Montague suggested, "we might discuss something other than your book. Our guests didn't come here to be lectured." "Didn't they?" Her husband's smile was pleasant, dangerous. "I rather think they did. Why else would they accept an invitation from a man they variously fear, despise, or wish to see silenced?" The silence that followed this remark was absolute. Even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling. Poirot rose. "You have a study, I believe, Professor? You mentioned showing me your collection of first editions." The professor's expression shifted, became almost boyish. "Would you?" "I'd be delighted. Captain Hastings, you must come as well. I have a signed trollop you'll appreciate." We followed him from the drawing-room. The study lay at the end of a short corridor, a masculine sanctuary of leather and dark wood. Books lined every wall. A desk dominated the space, its surface covered with papers held down by a paperweight shaped like an owl. "Magnificent," I said, and meant it. "My refuge." Montague crossed to a cabinet. The world intrudes everywhere else, but here I can think. The manuscript is nearly complete. Just the final chapter remains to be refined. He gestured to a stack of papers on the desk. My magnum opus, or my funeral pyre, depending on one's perspective. Poirot examined a shelf of volumes. The owl, it is an interesting choice for a paperweight. Symbol of wisdom, Monsieur Poirot, though in Greek mythology also associated with death. The professor gestured to the decanter on his desk. I have an excellent port if you're interested, though I myself prefer to save mine for later, after guests depart, when I can properly savour it in solitude. Dr. Markham appeared in the doorway, drawn by our voices. Admiring the collection? Indeed. The professor opened a cabinet, revealing rows of leather-bound first editions. Markham moved closer, running his fingers along a shelf. You have the Dioscorides first edition. Remarkable. The section on poisonous plants is particularly detailed. You know your classical text, Markham, the professor said. One remembers what one has studied. Markham's tone was neutral. You'll forgive the observation, Poirot said, but you seem to take pleasure in disturbing your guests, Professor. I take pleasure in honesty. Montague's smile was thin. Most people spend their lives constructing elaborate deceptions. I merely hold up a mirror. And if the reflection is unwelcome, then perhaps they should have lived differently. We spent perhaps 20 minutes examining the collection. Montague proved a knowledgeable guide, his passion for books evident. Yet beneath his enthusiasm, I sensed something else, a sort of grim satisfaction, as though he were a general surveying a battlefield before engagement. When we returned to the drawing-room, champagne had appeared. The atmosphere had lightened somewhat in our absence, or perhaps merely shifted into a different key. Miss Lenoir stood by the piano, one hand resting on its closed lid. Do you play, Mrs. Montague? Poorly, I'm afraid. I'm sure you're too modest. The dancer's smile was enigmatic. We all have hidden talents, do we not? The clock on the mantel chimed 11:30. Professor Montague set down his champagne glass. If you'll excuse me for a moment, I must fetch something from my study. A passage from the manuscript I want to read to you all. Won't be but a minute. He left the room. Conversation resumed, but it felt forced now, artificial. Mrs. Montague refilled glasses with mechanical grace. Dr. Markham stood at the window, staring into the darkness of the square below. Miss Howell and Mr. Vale spoke in low voices near the bookshelf. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Mrs. Montague glanced at the clock. How odd, he's usually so prompt. 15 minutes. Perhaps I should check, she said, rising. We followed her into the corridor. The study door stood slightly ajar. Mrs. Montague pushed it open. Alistair? Professor Montague sat at his desk, head bowed as though reading. The manuscript lay before him. His port glass, half empty, rested near his right hand. Alistair, Mrs. Montague repeated, moving forward. Then she screamed. Poirot was at the desk in an instant. He touched the professor's neck, his face grave. Hastings, telephone for a doctor, and the police. He looked up at the group clustered in the doorway. Do not touch anything. Nobody must leave this house. Professor Alistair Montague would challenge no more assumptions. Whatever truths his final chapter contained, he would not live to reveal them. In the doorway, caught in the hinge, a single black feather stirred in the draught. Chapter 3. The Little Grey Cells Observe. The doctor arrived within 20 minutes, a harried-looking man who confirmed what we already knew. Professor Montague was dead, and had been for at least a quarter of an hour. Inspector Japp followed shortly after, his solid presence filling the study doorway. He surveyed the scene with the methodical efficiency of long experience. Right then, nobody's touched anything? His gaze swept over us. Poirot, myself, Mrs. Montague, standing white-faced in the corridor, and the other guests clustered behind her like uncertain ghosts. Nothing, Poirot confirmed. The door was closed when we discovered him. Mrs. Montague opened it, saw her husband, and called for us. Natural causes, most likely, the doctor ventured. Heart failure, perhaps. The port suggests he was relaxing before. Non. Poirot's interruption was quiet but absolute. He moved to the desk, his green eyes intent. Regard the glass, if you please, half empty, yes. But observe the position of the liquid remaining. See how it clings to one side. The glass was moved after the professor collapsed, tilted, then set down again. Japp leaned closer. Could have knocked it himself as he fell. The professor sits upright in his chair. A man in the throes of heart failure would slump forward, perhaps sweep the glass from the desk entirely. He would not tilt it precisely and replace it. Poirot's nostrils flared slightly. And there is something else. A scent in this room. Faint, but distinct. I sniffed. Perfume? Not perfume. Something more clinical. He straightened. Inspector, I believe you will find this was not a natural death. The doctor bristled. I've seen no signs of violence. There are many ways to kill a man, doctor, that leave no visible marks. Poirot turned to Japp. You will send the port for analysis, yes, and the body for thorough examination. Japp's expression had shifted from skepticism to attention. He knew Poirot well enough. You're saying murder. I am saying that the circumstances require investigation. Mrs. Montague swayed slightly. I moved to steady her, guiding her to a chair in the corridor. The other guests had retreated to the drawing-room, their voices a low murmur of shock and speculation. Poirot began his examination of the study with painstaking care. He moved around the desk, examining papers without touching them. The manuscript lay in neat stacks, but I noticed his eyes pause on the final pile. Inspector, the professor mentioned his final chapter. These pages here, they end mid-sentence. The conclusion is missing. Japp joined him. Perhaps it's elsewhere, another room. Perhaps. Poirot's tone suggested he thought otherwise. He moved to the door, crouching to examine the hinges with minute attention. Ah, regardez. Caught in the door hinge was a single black feather, long, elegant, unmistakably from an ornamental costume. The dancer, Japp said. Miss Lenoir wore feathers in her hair. She did indeed. Poirot carefully extracted the feather, holding it to the light. Most curious. The placement, it is too perfect, no? Caught precisely where it would be discovered. Yet Miss Lenoir did not enter this study when the professor was here. We were with him the entire time. She could have come earlier. Could have, yes. Poirot placed the feather on the desk. We must ask her. The interviews began in the drawing-room. Japp took each guest separately into the dining-room, while Poirot observed with his characteristic stillness. Miss Lenoir acknowledged the feather at once. From my costume, yes, I wore it to dinner. A theatrical affectation, perhaps, but I cannot resist dramatic touches. Her composure was remarkable. I did not enter the professor's study this evening. I had no reason to. You left the drawing-room twice during the evening, Japp noted, consulting his notes. The maid confirmed it. Once to the ladies' cloakroom before dinner, once to the powder-room during coffee. She met his gaze without flinching. Both are on the ground floor. The study is upstairs. Dr. Markham was next. His restless hands betrayed his nerves, though his voice remained steady. I retrieved my coat from the cloakroom. I'd left it there when I arrived. The evening was warm, and I'd forgotten it until the temperature dropped. He paused. The cloakroom is near the study corridor, yes, but I saw no one, heard nothing unusual. What time was this? Poirot asked from his corner. During coffee, perhaps 11 o'clock. I was only gone a few minutes. Miss Howell admitted to wandering the house during sherry before dinner. I was admiring the professor's art collection. He has had a small Rossetti in the upstairs hallway. I am an admirer of the pre-Raphaelites. Mr. Vale had remained in the drawing-room throughout. I spoke with Mrs. Montague most of the evening about the manuscript, about publication timelines. She can confirm it. She could and did. Mrs. Montague's interview was brief. She had played hostess, moving between guests, ensuring comfort. She had not entered the study since early afternoon, when she'd prepared it for her husband's later use. "He liked his port waiting," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Always the same routine. After entertaining, he would retreat to his study with his papers and his port. I'd learned to have everything ready. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You prepared the port this afternoon." I placed the glass and decanter on his desk. He preferred to pour it himself. She twisted her hands together. "Is that important?" "Everything is important, madame. Everything." After the interviews concluded, Japp drew Poirot aside. "The medical examiner will have preliminary results by morning, but if this was poison, as you seem to think, the symptoms suggest it, the half-consumed port, the position of the body, the timing." Poirot moved to the window, looking down at the darkened garden below. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you see in that garden?" Japp peered out. "Garden, pond, trees, what am I looking for?" "The pond. What floats upon it?" I joined them at the window. In the lamplight, spilling from the house, I could just make out the dark shape of something floating motionless on the water's surface. "Good God," I said. "Is that the Professor's Swan?" Poirot's voice was grim. "I noticed it when we first arrived, swimming peacefully. Now it floats, and I do not think it swims any more." Japp's face hardened. "The same poison? We shall see. But if so, then we are dealing with something most sinister. Someone who tests their method before deploying it. Someone methodical, scientific." He turned from the window. "Someone who plans with great care." "The doctor," Japp said. "Markham. He's got the knowledge." "Knowledge? Yes. But let us not rush to conclusions. Knowledge can be acquired by many means." Poirot collected his hat and coat. "Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall know more. The post-mortem will tell its tale, the Swan will tell another, and the little grey cells, they will arrange these facts into their proper order." "And the feather?" "Ah, the feather. That, mon ami, is either our most valuable clue or our most elaborate deception. Time will reveal which." We left the Montague townhouse as the church clock struck 2. The square lay silent under a thin rain. Behind us, constables stood guard at the door, and inside a murdered man sat at his desk, his secrets dying with him. Or so the murderer hoped. But Hercule Poirot had observed what others missed: the tilted glass, the missing pages, the convenient feather, the dead swan floating in darkness. And somewhere in those observations lay the truth, waiting to be assembled by the little grey cells into a picture of murder most calculated. Chapter 4. The Hidden Threads. The following morning found Poirot and myself in a small cafe near the British Museum. Rain streaked the windows. My friend had requested this meeting away from both Scotland Yard and the Montague townhouse, neutral ground, as he put it, for neutral thinking. "You have been making inquiries, Hastings." Poirot stirred his coffee with meticulous care. "As you asked." I consulted my notebook. Rather an illuminating morning, actually. Started with Vale, the publisher. His offices are in Bloomsbury, naturally Russell Square, 3 doors down from the professor's house. Convenient? Or damning, depending on one's view. "The firm's in trouble, Poirot. Deep trouble. Vale and Company owes creditors nearly £10,000. Montague's book was to save them. Advance sales based on the controversy alone would have cleared the debt. And now? Now Mrs. Montague controls the manuscript. Vale has no legal claim to publication without her consent. I paused. He seemed rather desperate when I spoke with him, kept asking whether the police would allow him to approach the widow about proceeding with the book. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. A man whose salvation depends upon a scandal, most interesting. And the others? Miss Howell proved more difficult to approach. Lives in a boarding house in Fitzroy Square, very respectable, very quiet. The landlady was willing to chat, though. Apparently our novelist's last book sold poorly. The one before that prompted a lawsuit which she lost, cost her a considerable sum. The lawsuit, it concerned what? Character defamation. She'd based a villain too closely on a real person, a literary critic who'd given her previous work a poor review. The critic sued and won. I flipped a page. The landlady mentioned that Montague had been to visit Miss Howell twice in the past month. The conversations were heated, raised voices, slammed doors. He was threatening her? Warning her, the landlady thought. Something about her new manuscript. Miss Howell submitted it to Vale and Company 6 weeks ago. Montague read it as part of his arrangement with the publisher. He consulted on controversial works. Poirot set down his cup. And he found it controversial? Found it actionable. Told Vale he'd recommend against publication unless certain passages were removed. Passages that apparently depicted recognizable Bloomsbury figures in unflattering situations. I met Poirot's gaze. The book was Miss Howell's last chance at financial recovery. Without it, she faces bankruptcy. So the publisher needed the professor's book to survive, while the novelist needed the professor's silence to publish. Poirot steepled his fingers. The web. It grows more complex. What of Dr. Markham? Ah, Markham's the most interesting of the lot. I leaned forward. Took some digging, but I found a colleague of his at King's College who was willing to talk. 10 years ago, Markham published a groundbreaking paper on botanical toxins, made his reputation, led to a professorship, acclaim, the works. But Professor Montague discovered irregularities. The research data had been falsified, experiments that were never conducted, results that were fabricated. Montague confronted Markham privately, gave him a choice, resign quietly, and the matter would remain confidential or face public exposure and professional ruin. Markham resigned, left King's College, claimed ill health, took a position at a minor provincial university. His career never recovered. I checked my notes. He's been lecturing at a teacher's college in Croydon for the past 8 years, barely scraping by. The colleague I spoke with said Markham applied for reinstatement at King's last year. The application was rejected. Did Montague oppose it? Strenuously. Wrote to the committee detailing the original fraud. Markham's name in academic circles is mud, and Montague kept it that way. Poirot was silent for a moment, his green eyes distant. And the manuscript's final chapter, we may assume it would have detailed this fraud publicly. The colleague seemed to think so, said Markham had been behaving strangely the past few weeks, agitated, asking questions about libel law and academic privacy. A man with nothing left to lose. Poirot drew out his small notebook. Now we come to Miss Lenoir. What did you discover about our Black Swan? That required different methods. I spoke with a theatrical agent in Covent Garden who handles continental performers. He knew of her. I hesitated. There was a scandal in Paris 5 years ago. An aristocrat, the Comte de Montfort, died suddenly at his estate. Miss Lenoir had been his guest that weekend. She'd been his companion for some months. The cause of death? Officially heart failure, but there were rumours. The Comte's family suspected poison. Nothing was ever proved, but Miss Lenoir left Paris rather abruptly, changed her stage name, performed in Berlin and Vienna for several years, before returning to Paris under her current identity. And Montague knew this? The agent seemed to think so, said the professor had made inquiries about her background 3 weeks ago, offered to pay for detailed information. Poirot tapped the table with one precise finger. She comes to London, performs, maintains her mystery, then receives an invitation to dine with a man who has researched her past, a man famous for exposure and revelation. You think he was threatening her? I think, mon ami, that our professor was a man who collected secrets the way others collect stamps. Each guest at that dinner carried a burden, a vulnerability that Montague had identified and documented. He paused. What of Mrs. Montague herself? Now there's a puzzle. She came from modest circumstances, daughter of a vicar in Hampshire. Met the professor when she was 23, working as a research assistant at the British Museum. They married within 6 months. That was 7 years ago. The marriage settlement. Ironclad, if she divorces him or if the marriage ends due to scandal touching her reputation, she receives nothing. But if he dies while they're married in good standing, she inherits everything, the house, his savings, the book royalties. How much? Somewhere north of £50,000. Poirot's expression remained neutral, but I saw the calculation in his eyes. And if the book is published posthumously, he said softly, the scandal would be even greater. The sales, they would be considerable. You can't think, Mrs. Montague. I think nothing yet. I observe, I collect, I arrange. He drained his coffee cup. But consider, Hastings, every person in that drawing-room had reason to want Montague silenced, the publisher for his business, the novelist for her livelihood, the doctor for his reputation, the dancer for her secrets, and the wife for her inheritance. And the missing final chapter? That, mon ami, is the key. Someone took those pages from the study, someone who appears in them, perhaps, someone who believed that destroying that chapter would destroy the evidence against them. He rose, straightening his coat. We must speak with Mrs. Montague again, and I wish to visit a certain botanical laboratory. Botanical? The scent in the study, Hastings. It was not violet perfume. It was something far more specific. His eyes gleamed. Something that suggests our murderer possessed knowledge of a very particular kind. Outside, the rain had stopped. Russell Square lay quiet in the grey morning light, keeping its secrets behind elegant Georgian facades. But Poirot, I knew, would tease those secrets into the open. He always did. Chapter 5. The Black Swan Falls. Inspector Japp arrived at Poirot's rooms just after 3 o'clock that afternoon. He carried a folder thick with documents and wore the expression of a man who had reached a satisfactory conclusion. We got her, Poirot, he announced, settling into a chair. The case is as clear as daylight. Poirot looked up from the botanical reference book he'd been consulting. You refer to Miss Lenoir? Who else? The evidence is damning. Japp opened his folder. First, the feather. She admits it came from her costume. Wore the blasted thing to dinner like some sort of exotic bird. Second, her wandering about the house during the evening. The maid confirms she left the drawing-room twice, once before dinner and once during coffee. Many people moved about the house that evening, Poirot observed, but only one had a scandalous past involving a suspicious death. I've been in contact with the French police. The Comte de Montfort business. It's worse than we thought. The man's personal physician was convinced he'd been poisoned. The family physician ruled heart failure, but there were doubts, significant doubts. Yet no charges were brought. The family wanted to avoid scandal, but they paid Miss Lenoir a substantial sum to leave France and never return. Japp leaned forward. Montague knew about it. We found correspondence in his desk. Letters to a private inquiry agent in Paris, dated 3 weeks ago. He'd been investigating her thoroughly. And you believe she killed him to prevent exposure? I believe she's done it before and saw an opportunity to do it again. Japp pulled out another document. The medical examiner's full report came through this morning. The poison was derived from yew berries, a botanical alkaloid that mimics heart failure. Bitter taste, but easily masked by port wine. Death would occur within 15 to 20 minutes of ingestion. Poirot set down his book. The yew tree, it is common in England. Common enough, but preparation of the poison requires knowledge, skill. Japp's smile was triumphant. And here's the kicker. We've traced Miss Lenoir's movements over the past fortnight. She visited Kew Gardens 3 times. 3 times, Poirot. The botanical gardens, where yew trees grow in abundance. Many people visit Kew Gardens. Not to study toxic plants. The curator remembers her. Said she asked specific questions about the yew, its properties, its cultivation, which parts of the plant were most poisonous. Japp closed his folder. I'm bringing her in for formal questioning this evening. The magistrate will issue a warrant by tomorrow morning. Poirot rose and moved to the window. Rain had returned, draping London in grey. You are certain of this course? As certain as I've been of anything. Japp stood. She had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge to commit the crime. The feather places her at the scene. Her past demonstrates capability. What more do you need? The truth, mon ami, which is not always the same as certainty. After Japp departed, I turned to Poirot. You disagree with his conclusion? I disagree with his haste. He returned to his chair, his fingers forming a steeple. The case against Miss Lenoir, it is too perfect, too convenient. But the evidence is arranged, presented, like flowers in a vase, no? Each piece carefully placed to create the desired impression. He tapped the botanical reference book. This morning I visited the laboratory at University College, spoke with a Professor Davies who specializes in plant toxins. And the scent in Montague's study, it was not violet perfume, as we initially supposed. It was formaldehyde mixed with plant preservative, a very specific compound used in botanical research. He paused. Miss Lenoir is a dancer, Hastings. She performs, she travels, she moves in artistic circles. When would she have acquired such specialized knowledge? Perhaps the Comte de Montfort was 67 years old with a documented heart condition. His physician suspected poison because the family wanted an excuse to be rid of an inconvenient mistress. The French police found no evidence because there was no evidence to find. Poirot's voice was sharp. I have spoken to my contacts in Paris. The payment to Miss Lenoir was guilt money, compensation for forcing her to leave due to unfounded accusations. I felt a stirring of doubt. Then the feather was placed in the door deliberately by someone who wished to direct suspicion toward the most obvious foreign element in the room. He rose again, pacing now. Consider the timing, Hastings. The professor drank his port in the study. We were with him. We saw him pour it, saw him drink. He was alive and well when we left that room. Then the poison must have been in the glass already. Précisément. Which means it was placed there before we entered the study. During dinner, perhaps, or earlier still. He stopped pacing. Who left the drawing room before the professor retired to his study? I thought back. Well, Miss Lenoir, as Japp said, and Dr. Markham mentioned retrieving his coat, said he'd left it in the cloakroom near the study. Ah, yes, the good doctor. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Tell me, what do you recall of our conversation with him in the study? He seemed knowledgeable about the books, made some comment about the owl paperweight. No, before that, when we first entered. Poirot pulled out his own small notebook. He made a remark about botanical toxins. Do you remember? The professor showed us his collection, and Markham said, You have the Dioscorides, first edition. Remarkable. The section on poisonous plants is particularly detailed. So a man who lost his career over falsified botanical research makes a very specific comment about poisonous plants, then retrieves his coat from a cloakroom adjacent to the study where poison was later administered. Poirot's voice was soft. And the scent in that study was not perfume. It was the smell of a laboratory. You think, Markham? I think we must speak with him again this afternoon. He checked his watch. But first I must visit the Montague house once more. There is something about that garden Swan that troubles me. The bird? But it died the morning after the murder. Exactly so. Poirot reached for his coat. When the Swan dies before the master, Hastings, it is not coincidence. It is rehearsal. We took a taxi to Russell Square. The Montague townhouse stood quiet, its windows dark. Mrs. Montague received us in the drawing-room, her mourning dress severe against the pale furnishings. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I am afraid this is not a convenient time. I apologize for the intrusion, madame. I require only a moment. Poirot gestured toward the garden. The Swan that died, when exactly was it discovered? The morning after my husband's death. The gardener found it floating in the pond when he came to work. And the bird had been in good health previously? Perfectly healthy. My husband was very particular about its care. Who had access to the garden? Mrs. Montague frowned. Anyone in the house, I suppose. The garden door from the study was kept unlocked during the day. The study? Poirot's voice sharpened. You are certain? My husband liked to walk in the garden while he worked. He found it aided his thinking. Poirot thanked her, and we left. Outside he stood looking up at the house, his expression intent. The garden door from the study, he murmured. Of course. The poisoner needed to test the dosage, needed to ensure the mixture would work without arousing suspicion. What better subject than a swan? But the Swan only died last night, the same time as the professor. Précisément. The poisoner administered the poison to both the Swan and the professor on the same afternoon, testing the dose on the bird first, then preparing the professor's glass with the exact same concentration. Both victims consumed the poison within hours of each other. The Swan, being smaller and kept outdoors in the cold, succumbed more quickly, perhaps within an hour. The professor, larger and in the warmth of his study, took longer. He turned away. It was the perfect test. If the Swan died quietly, the poisoner knew the method would work, and only one person at that dinner possessed both the knowledge to create such a poison and the access to administer it. Markham. We must find him, Hastings, before Inspector Japp arrests the wrong person and the true murderer escapes justice. But when we reached Dr. Markham's lodgings in Bloomsbury, we found them empty. The landlady informed us he had departed that morning with a single suitcase, leaving no forwarding address. Poirot's face was grim. He runs, which means he knows we are close to the truth. The net was closing, but whether we would catch our quarry before he vanished into the grey London afternoon remained to be seen. Chapter 6. The Truth Afloat. Dr. Markham was found 3 hours later at Victoria Station, ticket to Dover in hand. Inspector Japp brought him directly to the Montague townhouse, where Poirot had requested all the suspects be assembled. They gathered in the drawing-room like actors awaiting their cue. Mrs. Montague sat near the window, her face pale. Miss Lenoir stood by the fireplace, her composure intact, but her eyes watchful. Miss Howell occupied a chair near the door, her hands clasped tight. Mr. Vale paced by the bookshelf, unable to settle. And Dr. Markham sat in the centre of it all, flanked by 2 constables, his expression carved from stone. "Right then, Poirot," Japp said. "You asked for this gathering. I've indulged you, but I've got my man and I've got a boat to Dover he was planning to catch." The boat, yes. Poirot stood before the fireplace. A man who runs appears guilty, does he not? It is what we expect. He turned to Markham. Why did you flee, Doctor? Markham's jaw tightened. I had business on the continent. With a single suitcase and no return ticket? Most unconvincing. Poirot's tone was gentle. You fled because you knew suspicion was turning toward you, because you possessed knowledge of botanical poisons, because your career was destroyed by the man now dead. I didn't kill him. No, that is correct. You did not kill Professor Montague. Poirot's statement fell into the room like a stone into still water. But you believed you would be accused, and so you ran. The action of a frightened man, not a guilty one. Japp stepped forward. Now see here, Poirot. A moment, mon ami. Let me show you the truth. Poirot moved to the centre of the room. We begin with the evidence. A glass of poisoned port, a black feather, a dead swan, a missing manuscript chapter, each piece carefully arranged to tell a story. The story that Miss Lenoir killed him, Vale interjected. Précisément. The foreign dancer with the scandalous past, how convenient. Poirot's gaze swept the room. But consider, the feather was placed in the door hinge, not dropped accidentally, but positioned where it would be found. Miss Lenoir is many things, but she is not careless. Miss Lenoir's eyes met his. She said nothing. Then there is the scent in the study. I was told it was violet perfume, but violet perfume does not linger for hours in a room. It fades. What I smelled was formaldehyde and botanical preservative, the scent of a laboratory. Dr. Markham shifted in his chair. The poison itself was sophisticated, derived from yew berries, prepared to specific concentration, tested beforehand to ensure effectiveness. Poirot paused. Tested on the garden swan, which died quietly, without struggle, the perfect rehearsal. Then Markham did do it, Japp insisted. He has the knowledge. He has knowledge, yes, but knowledge alone does not make a murderer. We must also consider opportunity and method. Poirot turned to the doctor. You retrieved your coat from the cloakroom during the evening. You mentioned it yourself. This gave you access to the corridor near the study. I took my coat and returned to the drawing-room, Markham said. I was there when the professor went to his study. Everyone saw me. Just so, you could not have poisoned the port while the professor was in the study, and you were observed in the drawing-room beforehand. Poirot's voice softened. But there was another person who had access to that study before dinner. Someone who knew the professor's habits. Someone who understood that he always took port from the decanter in his study before retiring for the evening. Mrs. Montague stood abruptly. What are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, madam. I state facts. Poirot's green eyes were steady. The port was poisoned before the dinner began. The glass sat waiting on the professor's desk, prepared hours in advance. When we entered the study with the professor, the glass was already there. I observed it, but did not understand its significance. Anyone could have entered the study before dinner, Vale protested. Could they? The servants were occupied with preparations. The guests had not yet arrived. Who else had access to that room? Who else knew the professor's habits so intimately? Poirot's gaze never left Mrs. Montague. Who else stood to inherit £50,000? The silence stretched thin. This is absurd, Mrs. Montague said, her voice held steady. I loved my husband. Perhaps. Love takes many forms, does it not? Sometimes it resembles captivity. Poirot moved closer. You married a man who controlled you, who held your past, your reputation, your future in his hands, who threatened to expose the others in his final chapter, but kept you suspended in perpetual anxiety. What if he decided you were no longer useful? What if he sought divorce? Your settlement was clear. Scandal or divorce meant you received nothing. You have no proof. I have botanical evidence. The compound used required not just knowledge but access to specific materials. Professor Davies at University College was most helpful. He confirmed that Helena Montague worked as his research assistant 7 years ago. She assisted him in cataloguing toxic plant specimens. She had the knowledge. Mrs. Montague's face had gone white. "And I have the testimony of your maid," Poirot continued. "She confirmed you entered the study the afternoon before the dinner. You told her you were preparing the room for guests. In truth, you were preparing the port, adding the poison to a single glass, placing it on the desk where your husband would find it. You knew his habits. You knew he would drink it." "The feather," Japp said quietly. "She planted the feather to cast suspicion on Miss Lenoir." "Precisely. During dinner she had ample opportunity. She moved about as hostess, ensured everyone's comfort. It would have been simple to place the feather in the study door. And the manuscript chapter, she removed it after his death, fearing it might contain something that implicated her." Mrs. Montague's composure cracked. "He was going to leave me. He told me that afternoon, said he'd found someone younger, or stimulating, that I'd served my purpose." Her voice broke. 7 years I gave him. 7 years of playing the perfect wife while he collected his poisonous secrets, and then to be discarded like one of his finished manuscripts. "So you poisoned him." "I tested it first, on his precious Swan. He loved that bird more than he ever loved me." A strange smile crossed her face. "It died so quietly. No struggle? No pain? Just sleep. And you wish the same for him?" "I wished him gone. I wished to be free." She looked around the room, her eyes bright. "Do you know what it's like to live with a man who holds your entire existence in his hands, who reminds you daily that you came from nothing and can return to nothing at his whim?" Japp moved forward. "Helena Montague, I am arresting you for the murder of Professor Alistair Montague." As the constables led her away, she passed Miss Lenoir. The dancer's face was expressionless, but she inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgment perhaps, or a salute. The room emptied slowly. Dr. Markham left without a word, his relief evident in every line of his body. Miss Howell and Mr. Vale departed together, their futures uncertain, but their immediate fears removed. Only Miss Lenoir remained. She turned to Poirot. "You knew I was innocent from the beginning." "I knew the evidence against you was too perfect, too arranged, like a stage set designed to direct the audience's attention." He paused. "The Black Swan was meant to take the fall, but swans, mademoiselle, are stronger than they appear." "Merci, Monsieur Poirot." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "The Comte de Montfort. His death was natural, but I have lived under suspicion ever since. Perhaps that is its own kind of poison. Perhaps. But you are free of it now." After she left, I turned to Poirot. "The wife, I should have seen it." "Why should you, mon ami?" She played her role perfectly. The grieving widow, the shocked survivor. He retrieved his hat and coat. But the little grey cells, they observed what the eyes missed, the laboratory knowledge, the intimate access. The motive of desperation, rather than greed. We stepped out into Russell Square. Evening had fallen, and the street lamps cast pools of yellow light. "Poor creature," I said. Poirot glanced back at the house. "Poor, yes, but also dangerous. That is the nature of desperation, Hastings. It transforms the victim into the executioner." The square lay quiet around us. Its secrets finally surrendered to the light. Epilogue. The following afternoon found us taking tea in Poirot's rooms. Rain drummed against the windows, but within all was warmth and comfort. Miss Lemon had departed, leaving the tea things arranged with her usual precision. I stirred my cup, my thoughts returning to the previous evening. The black swan, all that suspicion simply because of a feather. A feather placed deliberately, Hastings, that is the point. Poirot selected a biscuit with care. Mrs. Montague understood human nature. She knew we would suspect the foreign element, the dramatic outsider. Miss Lenoir was perfect, exotic, mysterious, with a scandalous past, the ideal scapegoat. And yet you saw through it. I saw that the evidence was arranged like flowers in a vase, too perfect, too artful. He sipped his tea. Appearances, mon ami, are like swans upon the water, graceful above, frantic beneath. In Bloomsbury they cherish intellect. Yet it was vanity, not genius, that committed murder. The professor's vanity in collecting secrets, and his wife's vanity in believing she could escape her cage through poison rather than honest separation. Poirot set down his cup. She had other choices, you understand. She could have left him, faced poverty perhaps, but retained her dignity. Instead, she chose murder. What will happen to her? The trial will be swift. The evidence is conclusive. Her own confession, the maid's testimony, the botanical records from University College. She will hang, I think. His expression was grave. And that, too, is a kind of tragedy. I glanced toward the window. I heard this morning that Mr. Vale plans to publish the professor's manuscript posthumously, the scandalous final chapter removed, of course. Of course, an act of mercy, or perhaps self-preservation. Without that chapter, the book loses much of its poison. Poirot's smile was faint. The professor sought to expose hypocrisy. Instead, his death exposed the ultimate hypocrisy, his own. He played God with other people's secrets while ignoring the desperation growing in his own home. And Miss Lenoir? Has she returned to Paris? This morning, I understand, the newspapers have been kind. They portray her as the wrongly accused innocent, which will enhance her mystique rather than damage it. She is a survivor, that one. And the others, Markham, Miss Howell, Vale. They scatter like birds after a stone is thrown. Dr. Markham has already left London. Miss Howell will find another publisher, I suspect. Mr. Vale will struggle on, perhaps with a posthumous edition of Montague's work to save his firm. Poirot paused. They all carried secrets, Hastings. The professor's death freed them from exposure, but it did not free them from themselves. I considered this. Rather a melancholy conclusion. Murder is always melancholy. It solves nothing, though the murderer believes it will solve everything. He rose, moving to the window. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm. But justice has been served, the truth has emerged from the depths. That must suffice. In Russell Square, I later learned, the pond lay still. The black swan was gone, but spring would bring new life to those quiet waters. Mrs. Helena Montague would face the consequences of her desperate act, and Hercule Poirot would add another case to his collection, another instance where the little grey cells had triumphed over carefully constructed deception. The black swan of Bloomsbury had flown, but the truth, at last, had come home to roost. Thank you for listening to The Black Swan of Bloomsbury here on Café Stories. This case reminds us that the most dangerous threats are not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet, patient, and carefully prepared long before anyone suspects harm. If this story intrigued your inner detective, please like, subscribe, and share. It truly helps the channel grow. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Did you suspect the truth early on, or did the misdirection work on you? Until next time, stay observant, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most elegant performances are the ones designed to hide fear. Thank you for being here with Café Stories.